Sometimes massive changes start with something really small. And that's exactly what happened here. It all started with just a single line. On March 6, 2026, buried deep inside a pretty standard state budget speech, one sentence kicked off this nationwide firestorm. We're talking about our kids, their phones, and their entire future. And believe me, this wasn't just about money. This was about drawing a brand new line in the digital sand. And there it is. With just those few words, Karnataka became the very first Indian state to propose an outright social media ban for kids under 16. Now, the pressure had been building for a while, especially after some really tragic stories linked to screen addiction. And then, get this, on the very same day, Andhra Pradesh jumped in, proposing its own ban. All of a sudden, India didn't just have a debate, it had a full-blown policy war on its hands.
But here's the thing you have to understand. This isn't just some isolated move by a couple of states. Nope, this is India plugging into a massive global wave. We're seeing countries like Australia, France, Spain, the entire EU. They're all making similar moves. So the real takeaway here is that governments all over the world are deciding that the digital Wild West, for our children, well, it has to end.
Okay, so to really get our heads around what's going on, here's our game plan. First, we'll dig into why this is all happening right now. Then we'll ask, is a ban like this even legal? We'll jump into the huge debate over whether it would even work. Then we'll look around the world for lessons before tackling the biggest question of all. Who is actually responsible for all this?
So let's start with the most obvious question. Why the sudden panic? What is driving governments to take a step as drastic as an outright ban?
Well, the answer is pretty stark. We're in the middle of a full-blown youth mental health crisis. I mean, we're seeing these skyrocketing rates of anxiety and depression among teenagers. Their sleep is being absolutely destroyed by late-night scrolling. These unrealistic, perfectly filtered images are creating severe body image issues. And all of this is happening in an environment that's just filled with cyberbullying and the constant threat of online predators.
And look, this isn't just talk or speculation. The Indian government's own economic survey flagged digital addiction as a key threat to the nation's youth. It directly linked heavy social media use to all these serious mental health problems. And when the government's top economic report sounds an alarm like that, you better believe policymakers start to listen.
You see, the real heart of the problem is that none of this is an accident. These social media platforms are literally engineered to be addictive. Features like infinite scroll and autoplay, they work on our brains just like a slot machine, giving us little hits of dopamine that keep us hooked and scrolling. Now, an adult brain really struggles to resist this, so imagine a child's brain, one that's still developing. It's an almost impossible fight.
So the problem is crystal clear. But the solution? That's where things get incredibly complicated. Because even if you decide you want to ban social media for kids, the very next question is, can you? I mean, does a state like Karnataka even have the legal power to pull it off?
And this right here is the core of the legal battle. Under India's constitution, power is divided between the states and the central government. So Karnataka argues this is a public health issue, which falls under its control. But, and this is a big but, the central government has exclusive power over the internet. And you can't regulate social media without regulating the internet, and that's the center's job. This whole situation puts the state's proposed ban on some very, very shaky legal ground.
Now, to make things even more complicated, India already has a national law that's supposed to deal with this. It's called the Digital Personal Data Protection Act, or the DPDP Act. It's meant to be the single nationwide rulebook for how companies handle our data. And guess what? It has a whole section dedicated just to kids.
And the rules in the DPDP Act are incredibly strict. For anyone under 18, companies must get what's called verifiable parental consent. It's also flat out illegal for them to track a child's online behavior, show them targeted ads, or do anything at all with their data that could potentially cause them harm. These are really powerful protections that are already the law of the land.
And just to show you how serious this is, the law includes massive penalties. If a company breaks these rules on children's data, they can be fined up to 200 crore rupees. That's a huge financial threat, and it's designed specifically to force these big tech companies to take child safety seriously. But, and there's always a but, isn't there? Here's the big catch. A law is only as good as its enforcement. The Data Protection Board, the actual group that's supposed to hand out these massive fines, well, it hasn't been set up yet. So what we have is a powerful law on paper, but right now, there's nobody steering the ship.
And it's this enforcement vacuum that's causing states like Karnataka to say, fine, we'll try to do it ourselves.
All right, let's move on to the absolute heart of the great debate. Even if you could legally enforce a ban, the question is, should you? Does a blanket ban actually work in the real world? Or does it just create a whole new set of even bigger problems?
Well, digital rights groups like the Internet Freedom Foundation argue that a ban is a simplistic, headline-grabbing move, not a serious policy. They say it sounds good in a speech, but in reality, it could actually end up doing more harm than good.
So the single biggest problem is something called the age verification paradox. Just think about it for a second. To enforce a ban, you have to know how old everyone is, right? The only truly reliable way to prove someone is over 16 is to check their government ID, like Aadhaar. But that would mean every single adult in India would have to upload their private ID to Facebook and Instagram just to prove they're not a kid. This would create a gigantic database, a honeypot basically, just waiting for hackers. So to protect kids, you'd have to sacrifice the privacy of every single adult. That's a massive trade-off. And that brings up another major problem. History shows us that prohibition often backfires, big time. When America banned alcohol in the 1920s, people didn't magically stop drinking. They just went to illegal, unregulated, and much more dangerous speakeasies. The fear is that the exact same thing will happen here. Kids won't stop going online, they'll just go underground. And, the big tech companies like Meta make this exact argument. They warn that if you kick teenagers off mainstream platforms, which have at least some safety features, they'll just migrate to more obscure, unregulated apps that have no safety teams and are far more dangerous. And the problems that are specific to India are also huge. First, there's the shared device problem. So many families in India share just one phone. How on earth do you enforce a ban in that house? Second, there's a real danger that a protection law could be used as an excuse to deny girls internet access entirely. And finally, what about children's rights? A blanket ban could strip a 15-year-old activist or a young journalist of their fundamental right to expression. So with all these complex, thorny problems, what are other countries doing? India isn't alone in this fight, not by a long shot. So let's take a look at the global playbook and see what we can learn. Honestly, the approaches are all over the map. You've got Australia going for a hard ban. France is demanding government IDs and even threatening criminal charges for tech execs. China imposes super strict time limits. The EU is focused on parental consent, and the UK has this interesting model where it places a legal duty of care on the platforms themselves. It's a real patchwork of different strategies.
So, if there's one crucial lesson to take from all this, it's that there is no one-size-fits-all solution. A simple copy-paste of Australia's model or France's model just won't work for India. Our sheer scale, the shared device culture, and the massive digital gender divide mean India has to forge its own path and invent its own solution. And that brings us to the path that India's central government seems to be considering. So while states are proposing this blunt instrument of a total ban, the center is actually working on a much more nuanced, more layered approach.
From what we understand, the central government is looking at a graded 3-tier system. For the youngest kids, under 13, a complete ban on social media. For the middle group, ages 13 to 15, they'd get access but with really strict guardrails, like time limits and no late-night use. And for the older teens, 15 to 17, they'd get fuller access but with safe-by-default settings and no targeted ads. It's really an attempt to balance protection with a child's growing autonomy. This quote from an official really gives us a window into their thinking. The belief at the center seems to be that a complete ban for all teenagers is just too extreme, and that a more balanced, thoughtful approach is what's really needed here. And experts argue that beyond just age limits, the real toolbox for child safety involves a few key things. First, actually set up the Data Protection Board to enforce the laws we already have. Second, mandate safety by design. Force platforms to turn off addictive features like autoplay for kids. And third, massively boost digital literacy education in our schools, all while making absolutely sure we don't make the digital gender divide any worse. And all of this leads us to the final and maybe the most important question in this entire debate. When we talk about protecting our kids online, where does the buck really stop? Who is ultimately responsible? Let me give you an analogy that I think puts this perfectly. If a factory is dumping toxic waste into a river, what do? Do you just go around telling people to stop drinking the water? Or do you go to the factory and force it to stop polluting at the source? For years, we've been focused on telling parents and kids to be more responsible, to somehow drink less of the polluted water. But more and more people are arguing that we've been blaming the victim all along. The simple reality is that a single parent is in a completely unfair fight against an army of engineers at a trillion-dollar company whose entire job is to capture and hold their child's attention. This isn't a family issue, it's a public health issue. The government regulates our food, our alcohol, our medicine. The argument is that the digital world should be absolutely no different. The primary responsibility has to be on the companies that built and profited from these platforms in the first place. So, as India stands at this huge digital crossroads, the choice seems pretty stark: a blanket ban or a more nuanced, graded approach. But remember, this isn't just about social media. This is about what kind of digital future we want to build for the next generation of Indians. So, what do you think is the right path forward?